During the Russian Civil War, the Polish forces had marched eastwards to restore the borders of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Having overcome most of its opposition in the Civil War, Soviet Russia set out to defeat Poland. This would lead to the battle that would decide the future of Poland. The front was divided into the southern and northern part by the Pripyat marshes. Behind the Polish front, there were the old fortifications from World War I. The Red Army attempted an offensive on the northern part of the front in mid-May. It had 75,000 troops against 72,000 Poles. The Red Army moved westwards, but then the Polish forces counterattacked and it had to fall back. The Red Army began to wait for more reinforcements to arrive. In the south, the Polish forces had 57,000 troops against 37,000 Red Army soldiers. The strength of the Red Army lay in its cavalry. It could outmaneuver and encircle the Polish troops. In late May, their cavalry broke through the Polish defenses. At the same time, another Red Army force crossed the Dnieper River and cut the rail communication with the Polish troops in the east. Only a small gap connected the Polish forces near Kyiv. They had to break out from their position and retreat westwards. Poland had to spend a lot of effort to counter the Reds' cavalry. In the north, it gave up territory and retreated its forces to a shorter line. In the south, the Polish troops withdrew to better positions. The Polish forces were now strengthened for the upcoming battle. The Soviet cavalry then moved south and outflanked the Polish positions. They moved north and occupied Ruvne. The Polish forces launched the counterattack. They hit the Red cavalry from two sides. But their plan did not work. The Red Army Cavalry Division was able to move through the sparse Polish defenses behind their southern force. The Polish troops began to fall back. Their counteroffensive had failed. During the fighting, the Red Cavalry had lost part of its offensive power, and the Polish troops now found it easier to resist it. By that time, the Red Army had begun its main offensive in the north. The Red Army had now 97,000 troops against 37,000 troops on the northern front, a numerical advantage of 3-1. Poland wanted to make use of strong defensive terrain in order to compensate for the smaller number of its soldiers. Further west there was Lithuania, which was hostile to Poland. The Red Army went on the offensive in early July, and the Polish forces attempted to retreat to World War I trench positions. But the Red Army used its two cavalry divisions to disrupt the Polish retreat. They advanced and crossed the Great War trench lines before the Polish forces. Poland sent a small unit to counter it, but it was outmaneuvered by the Red Cavalry. Polish forces had to give up territory and retreat to Vilnius. There, they were once again outmaneuvered, and the Red Army occupied Vilnius. With the Polish army losing ground, Lithuania joined the war against them. With the Lithuanian army threatening their flank, the Polish forces decided to fall back to the Neman River. But as the Red Army pursued them, the Lithuanian forces and Red Army cavalry cut off and destroyed the westernmost Polish troops. The Red Cavalry moved south and occupied Grodno on the Polish defensive line. The Polish army could not retake these positions, and the Red Army outflanked their defensive line on the Neman River. The Poles decided to make a stand on the Narew and Bug rivers. During the war, life in the occupied territories was thrown into chaos. It must have felt as if civilization itself was coming to an end. This book, our sponsor today, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, might be just what we need now. It has nice illustrations, but it also contains the inner workings of civilization. And it's for intellectually curious people just like yourself. Now, let's check out some of the topics. Here we can learn about the art of bows and archery, and here you can find out how to generate electricity. It even covers tanks. Although I'm not sure these kinds of tanks were used in the Soviet-Polish War. These are just some of the topics. But there are 177 more topics covering everything from food and tools to art and society. Whether you're technically minded or more of a humanities person, this book has something for you. It invites you to think deeper about the systems that keep society running. This project has gained record support on Kickstarter and has been purchased by hundreds of thousands of people all around the world. And check out the level of craftsmanship. Its great illustrations, high quality paper and careful design make it a standout on any shelf. That makes it a fantastic gift for a smart friend, a curious family member, or even a treat for yourself. If you want to explore all of these 180 chapters and maybe even find a little hidden quest here, you can get the book for yourself or as a gift. Now just follow the link below. Now back to Poland. The Polish defensive line on the Neman River was broken, and the Polish army retreated to Nad and Bug rivers. The Red Army pursued the Polish forces westward. The Red Army forces were able to outflank the Polish positions on the Nad River from north and south. The Polish forces had to abandon it and continue the retreat. The Polish positions on the Bug River were now overextended and the Red Army crossed the Bug River. But at that time, the fighting was about to reach the Vistula River, which was a major obstacle. With mobilization and redeployments, the Polish forces had grown and now both sides had around 100,000 troops. Poland attempted to counterattack near Warsaw. In the south, the Polish forces deployed only a small part of its troops to defend the Vistula line. This allowed them to break contact with the Red Army forces in the south. In the north, the Red Cavalry broke through the Polish defenses and several Red Army divisions headed west. But they had the Vistula River on their way and Poland managed to hold on with light forces. These Red Army troops stayed out of main fighting. Poland sent its other troops to defend the area around Warsaw. There they were able to halt the advance of the remaining Red Army troops. At that time, the Polish forces in the south began the offensive. The 4 Polish divisions moved in behind the Red Army Southern Force. They linked up with their troops near Warsaw and cut off 2 Red Army divisions. The Polish forces in the east continued the advance and threatened to cut off the Red Army forces near the city. The Red Army began to fall back to prevent it from being encircled. This opened the way for the Polish counterattack to the north. The Polish forces moved north and cut off the Red Army forces that had advanced into the west. The Red Army troops turned around and began to move to reconnect with the rest of their troops. The Red Army troops in the west managed to break through the Polish encirclement, but they were soon met with other Polish forces and were blocked off from further retreat. They moved into German territory and were disarmed. The rest of the Red Army forces retreated east and were able to regroup by the end of August. At the same time, the fighting was continuing on the southern part of the front. Poland's main goal was to defeat the Red Cavalry. Poland organized strong cavalry forces of its own. These forces counterattacked and achieved some progress against the Red Cavalry. However, at that time, Poland redeployed part of the troops on the southern front to Warsaw. The remaining Polish forces were able to contain the advance of the Red Cavalry to the south. Then the Red Army redeployed its cavalry northwards. The Red Army sent it to another offensive, but this was a mistake. After the defeat of the Red Army in the north, Poland had now strong forces to deploy to the southern front. First Polish force arrived and surrounded the Red Cavalry. It attacked and defeated it. The Polish forces were strengthened even more. They inflicted even more casualties on the Red Cavalry. The Red Army retreated to the World War I fortifications. By that time, the Red Army forces had had time to regroup. The Red Army had 73,000 troops on the northern front against 96,000 Polish troops. The Polish forces now had a small numerical advantage. On the northernmost part of the front, the Polish forces were faced with the Lithuanian army. They were able to overrun the Lithuanian units and advance between the two armies. They then cut the roads to the Red Army forces in the north. The Reds attempted to retreat, but they were caught between two Polish forces and suffered heavy casualties. In the Pripyat marches, Belarusian and Polish units infiltrated behind the Red Army lines and advanced deep behind their positions. These events led to the Red Army retreat on the whole northern front. Soviet Russia could not resist its internal enemies and the Polish forces at the same time. The Red Army could not reinforce the front. Its forces continued to retreat. The Polish forces moved north and cut Soviet Russia off from Lithuania. They also occupied Vilnius and other disputed territories with Lithuania. In the south, Poland was relying on its cavalry forces to lead the offensive. They advanced on the central part of the front. The Red Army troops in the south began to retreat in order to avoid encirclement. The Polish cavalry advanced north and threatened to cut off the Red Army troops in the Pripyat marshes. Poland had retaken a lot of land. Its original goal was to restore the borders of the old Commonwealth as a federation consisting of Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. However, due to the losses it had suffered, it decided to just limit itself to creating a large Polish state. With these lands under Polish control, Poland signed a truce with Soviet Russia. The Belarusian and Ukrainian troops that had been allied with Poland were defeated by the Red Army. With that, fighting on the Soviet Russia's western front came to an end, but the internal struggles continued. The Bolshevik government was threatened by internal rebellions and the White forces in the south. Poland's success against the Red Army was aided by the White Russian forces fighting against the Bolsheviks in the south. After suffering defeat, part of the White forces had found refuge in the Crimea. The Red Army eventually began redeploying its forces against Poland. It left only 18,000 troops on the approaches to the Crimea. The Whites had retained 25,000 troops on the peninsula. The Whites landed their forces north of Crimea and outflanked the main Red Army positions. With the Whites threatening to cut off the Red Army path of retreat east, the Red Army forces retreated north behind the Dnieper River. The White forces then headed eastwards and occupied some territory. The Red Army prepared to launch a counterattack. The Red cavalry broke through the Whites' defenses, but the Whites surrounded it and the Red Army forces had to retreat. The Whites then made landings in the lands of the Don and Kuban Cossacks. However, by this, they had overextended their troops. Their landings had to withdraw back to their ships. The Whites also struggled to defend against another Red Army counteroffensive in the north. The Red Army was supported by an attack across the Dnieper River. In the east, the Red cavalry broke through again through the White lines. The Whites were able to counterattack and force the Red troops to retreat, but their position remained weakened. By that time, the Red Army began to suffer defeat in Poland. The White forces planned to advance west in order to link up with the Polish army. The Whites attacked northwards. They then headed east in order to draw away the Red Army. The Whites then launched their main attack and crossed the west bank of the Dnieper. However, then they were hit by a strong Red Army counterattack and they had to retreat back behind the river. By that time, Soviet Russia had signed a truce with Poland and could now fully concentrate against the White forces. By the end of October, it had deployed 143,000 troops against 37,000 Whites. The Red Army crossed the Dnieper in several places. Their troops moved towards Crimea and threatened to cut the White forces off. The Whites began to retreat to the Crimea, but they could not hold on to the favorable defensive positions on the approaches to the peninsula. The White forces quickly moved towards the ports, where they were evacuated, and their presence on the peninsula came to an end. With that, the last large regular army opposing the Bolsheviks' rule was defeated. Because of internal unrest, the Bolsheviks had to abandon their attempts to spread the revolution by force of arms. The fighting that had begun in Eastern Europe in 1914 was now finally over. If you want to see how we got to this point, you can check out these videos.